Subservient roles. As those who occupy subservient roles, we are to do all we can within the will of God to respect and submit to those we serve. Here's Gene.
Let's remember that Peter is writing to believers who are first century Christians who are scattered throughout what is now Turkey, which would be Asia, Bithynia, Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia. Those were the territories where Christians lived and operated and made a living. That's where their homes were located. And a great many of the believers throughout this particular territory were slaves. Many of them were slaves. And I'd just like to share a few facts regarding slavery in the first century world, what it was really like. And these are basic facts. It was a life of bondage for many, many slaves. Ancient Roman slaves were the backbone of the empire's economy. For example, 30% of all the people who lived in Italy, that part of the Roman Empire, were slaves. And they were a significant part of the economy. Secondly, a favorite slave of a wealthy patrician, aristocrat, could live in relative comfort. However, a lesser slave could literally be worked to death without mercy. So there was a great spectrum in relationship to how slaves were treated, except that they were all basically in bondage. Sometimes a rich man could have as many as 400 slaves. Think about that. This was huge in relationship to his particular economy and how things operated in the Roman world. Some slave owners beat their slaves, and the slaves that ran away could be killed, literally, without mercy. Slaves could not argue with their masters. It was yes or no, yes sir or no sir. They had to do exactly as they were told, or else they would be punished. So you had a great spectrum of activity and of expectations and the way the slaves were treated. Now, against that backdrop, it helps us to understand what Peter is writing to these Christians, many of whom were slaves, and others were also slave owners. And so with that in mind, let's look at what Peter said when he wrote slaves to masters. Household slaves, submit to your masters with all reverence, not only to the good and gentle ones, but also to the cruel. Now keep in mind that when these slaves became Christians, some of their slave owners were also Christians. They didn't all of a sudden change their economy and get rid of their slaves. That was a part of their culture. And some of the slaves' owners were non-Christians. And so here are Christian slaves, and they have to function within a very difficult situation where they had owners of them who were unbelievers, who had all different kinds of ethical standards in terms of the way they treated people. So Peter is writing here to a difficult situation. He goes on to say, for it brings favor if, because of a consciousness of God, someone endures grief from suffering unjustly. What Peter is saying is that God looks in a special way upon people who suffer for the cause of Jesus Christ because they are believers. For what credit is there if when you do wrong and are beaten, you endure it? But when you do what is good and suffer, if you endure it, this brings favor with God. Now, I don't believe that Peter is saying that God has ordained the suffering. What Peter is saying is that God looks upon people who endure suffering with a special blessing, and I think special reward, particularly in eternity, and we will see that as we move on in this this passage of Scripture. Now, Peter goes on to say, if you want to talk about suffering, talk about the example. Because Christianity was born in suffering, the greatest suffering, Jesus Christ himself, who suffered and died for the sins of the world. And so Peter goes on to say, for you were called to this, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And again, when he says you're called to this, he's simply saying because you are a Christian, this can happen. He's not saying I've called you to go through suffering, and you're going to go through suffering because I've ordained it. He's saying when you go through it, God is noticing in a very special way. And so Peter's encouraging these slaves who are experiencing this suffering because of masters that were not sensitive, some unbelievers. And so here's the example of Jesus. He did not commit sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was insulted, he did not insult in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. In other words, Jesus Christ understands suffering. And he wants these slaves to know that, and that they will be honored in a very, very special way. Now, it's interesting that when the Apostle Paul dealt with this issue in his letter to the Colossians and in his letter to the Ephesians, he also addressed masters. However, at this point, Peter doesn't refer to masters and how they're to treat their slaves, but we'll see, as you read on, he covers that base. And he'll do it in a very unique way, as we will see. So here's a reflection and a response question in terms of this particular principle. How does this principle of submission taught by Peter apply to employer-employee relationships, particularly within the family of God? Now that's moving from a situation, a master slavery situation, to a principle that can be applied in the relationships that we have within our culture that is free. And obviously in our culture, we're free from slavery, thank God. In our particular American culture, we were not always free from slavery. And you go back and you literally look at some of the situations that exist in our own culture before slaves were freed. There was a lot of similarity between the way they were treated in our culture and the way they were treated in the Roman culture. And they often sang songs that related to be submissive, so that you'll be treated fairly and not in a way that is destructive. But in our particular situation, free from slavery, we have rights within our culture. By law, as employees, we have rights. And thank God for those rights. And if our rights are violated, we have access to law, to the courts of law, to protect us, to help us. And consequently, you can see there's some enduring truths here, I think, that relate to our culture as well, even though we don't live in a slave-oriented culture. One thing that stands out, I think, in this principle is that we're never to take advantage of our employers. That's the way a Christian should respond to employment. We're not to steal, for example, time that we're paid for. We're to be responsible. We're to serve our employers like we're serving Jesus Christ. To make that application, we're to maintain a diligent work ethic. And then as employers, and we'll see a principle that emerges later, as employers, we're to treat our employees fairly, justly, and again, Who is our example? Jesus Christ. And so here is the principle, I think, that is universal and applies to every culture of the world. As those who occupy subservient roles, and who of us has not occupied a subservient role? We all occupy those roles in our relationships. So the principle reads, as those who occupy subservient roles, we're to do all we can within the will of God to respect and submit to those we serve.